George Galloway, who first was elected to Parliament in 1987, defeating Roy Jenkins, who was an architect of a previous era when the Labour Party at that time was seeking to bring about a socialist programme under Michael Foot's leadership in the early 1980s. And George has been a renowned campaign on a range of different issues, from Julian Assange to the Iraq War and a range of foreign policy and human rights issues. But today, I've asked George to join us to speak about particularly neoliberalism and whether or not the COVID-19 crisis could spell the beginning of the end for neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is an economic ideology that was foisted on the nation really by Margaret Thatcher in 1979, although the way was paved for her when Dennis Healey went to the International Monetary Fund in 1976 on the pretext that Britain was running out of money. But as a nation with its own sovereign currency, Britain can never run out of money. And the only real barrier to economic growth, economic success, is the capacity in the economy. But the consequences of neoliberalism have been laid bare for all to see, because it's pretty clear, I think, that from the way in which this government's not been able to respond appropriately to the COVID-19 crisis, that something does desperately need to change. After 40 years of neoliberalism, an economic ideology that Tony Blair's and indeed Gordon Brown's governments embraced, we've seen unparalleled in the modern era levels of inequality. In the world's fifth biggest economy, we have something like 14 million people living in poverty. Precarious employment now is endemic throughout the land. Our public services are in meltdown, and many of them have been used as a cash cow for the private sector. So clearly, this sort of trickle-down economics, leaving everything to the market, has been a catastrophic failure in terms of ensuring that the fruits of the nation's economic success are shared equitably amongst its citizens. But George, you're somebody who has espoused socialism for some time. You've established a new political party now, which is fighting for socialism. What's your take on neoliberalism? And do you think that the consequences of the COVID-19 crisis, the aftermath of it, might lead us to a different path being taken in the country?
Well, thanks for the introduction and the opportunity, Chris. It's always a pleasure to be on screen with you. The first thing that has to be said is the old Cuban slogan, "Walker, there is no path. The path is made by walking." So nothing is written, nothing is certain. It is not certain that it is the end of neoliberalism. But so catastrophic has been the neoliberal order. Either it's a coincidence that we've got two blonde-headed leaders who have both produced the worst death toll in the entire world, and pound for pound, ours is up there even with the United States of America. But it may be a coincidence, but it may not be a coincidence that the countries that gave us Reaganomics, Thatcher economics, the twin terrors of 1979-80, who have ruled uninterruptedly since, and you're right to make the point, throw in Blair and Brown there, because essentially these two governments were no different ideologically. So it's an unbroken line from 1980 until 2020, 40 years of neoliberalism. The performance has been so dismal. The disparity in wealth in both countries so grotesque. The failure of the public realm in both countries so complete that it has to raise the question, pose the question of whether or not we can continue with this model of capitalism, whether or not this model of capitalism can recover. My guess is that it cannot. It certainly cannot intellectually. It's laid bare The emperors have no clothes, and surely a larger number of people than ever before can now see that. And it would be very difficult to make the ideological case for the Boris Johnson, Donald Trump model of doing things when this is all over, and it's far from over yet. That, of course, then begs the question, well, what instead of this model? And there, of course, there are far, far more options on the table. The South Korean model of capitalism, which is quite an unusual one, quite unlike ours, has been a rip-roaring success. So has the Singaporean. So it's not necessarily true that socialism is posed as the only alternative, or even the likely alternative. We have to fight for that. As Che Guevara said, the revolution is not an apple that falls from the tree. We have to shake the tree, and we have to make sure the apple looks enticing enough to eat. And we're not quite there yet.
Well, you know, if you'd have said to me, and I suspect to you, 12 months ago, that a Tory government would be investing the amount of money that it is in the economy, albeit in a rather ham-fisted and haphazard way, you'd have said that you needed your head examining, I think. And so it's pretty clear, I think, that even this government recognises that their model of capitalism isn't fit for purpose in actually responding to this COVID-19 crisis. And I think there's an opportunity, isn't there, for those of us who want to see and believe in an alternative model, in a sort of a compassionate economic solution, which I think is only going to be brought about through a socialist program. But surely doesn't it give us the opportunity to say, look, when Theresa May said there was no such thing as the magic money tree, which is absolute nonsense, when you have, as I mentioned in my introduction, your own sovereign currency, you literally can't run out of money. You just create it in the Bank of England, the same in the United States of America, the National Fed there. You know, they don't have a problem with the availability of money. The issue is, surely, isn't it, the capacity in the economy. Do we have spare capacity in the economy? Is there a need in the economy? Well, quite clearly there is. We have millions of people who are still unemployed, even a bigger number of people who are underemployed in the United Kingdom. So there is spare labour capacity available in that sense. Then you look around and look at the crumbling state of our infrastructure, the desperate need that there is for a public housing programme. Our public services have been completely undermined. Our social care system is at the point of collapse. The privatisation model that's been inflicted upon it isn't working. There's a huge need out there. Many, many people are not getting the care that they need. So it seems to me, can we not make the case, George, to say, look, there is a massive need in the country. There is spare capacity in the country. We have our own sovereign currency. Thank God, one of the best things, maybe the only good thing that Gordon Brown did was to keep us out of the Eurozone. So what's to stop us? I mean, what the Tories have demonstrated now is that they can find the money when they want to. Isn't that something that we should be arguing for? That, you know, there is a different way forward?
Well, if you and I were the leaders of the Labour Party, and if this conversation were taking place on the BBC, then there would be every possibility of winning perhaps a majority of our people, certainly many, many millions, to that perspective that you have just ably outlined. But both of us are effectively expelled from the Labour Party, and we're not yet on the BBC, though our numbers are growing exponentially. Tonight on the mother of all talk shows online, more than 500,000 people will watch my show. So we are moving on up, but not yet there. And that point is not unimportant, because what you just outlined very ably, but at core, was ABC. Is the ABC of socialism, that labour is the source of all wealth, that the workers produce the wealth. And that's blatantly obvious right now. If the workers can't go to work, no wealth can be produced. We have the land, already. And what are the three components? They are land, labour, and capital. And as you rightly pointed out, the Tories are already manufacturing the capital. The presses are running right now in the Bank of England. The notion, the great money trick that Owen so wonderfully exposes in The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist is now laid bare by quantitative easing. So if we had the means of putting our alternative in front of the people, then of course we would stand a real fighting chance of winning our people to it. Of course, this is still raging. By the way, 4/5 of the public agree with us that the workers must not be sent back to work in a toxic environment. 4/5 of the British people are against this exit strategy that Sir Keir Starmer so woodenly rabbits on about. It's far too early for an exit strategy. We're still in a burning building, no doubt, but running into the flames is not going to be the answer. So if we had the opportunity, and we don't, and we can't avoid saying this, I know it's not strictly speaking your topic for the day, but the utter shambles of today's Labour Party and its so-called leadership. I mean, don't get me wrong, Chris, I've worked for Labour under some rum leaders. You know, he's not necessarily worse than every leader that Labour has ever had, but he's certainly the most ineffective and the most wooden and the most barren, and is headed in quite the wrong direction. And
I mean,
so
we've certainly
no
got...
No, just one last point. There's no possibility of this Labour Party under this leadership outlining the alternative, the socialist alternative, in the way that you have just done and the way I'm trying to do.
No, I mean, and I think the truth of the matter is that we've only probably had 2 or 3 occasions when we've had a leadership that's been willing to espouse a socialist program. Michael Foot, I think, although I don't think Michael got particularly close to getting into office. Although having said that, when Michael was first elected, as you'll recall, in that first year or so, Labour hit over 50% in the opinion polls, and it was only the advent of the SDP and then the so-called Falklands Factor, I think, which saw Thatcher winning a landslide victory in the 1983 election on the smaller share of the vote than she achieved in 1979. But isn't it the truth? I think the scales have been removed from my eyes, George, really, having spent 44 years devoting myself to the Labour Party. But isn't the truth really that ever since the franchise was extended in 1918, that for most of that time, if not all of that time, the Labour Party has been used as a tool of the establishment, really, to maintain the status quo? And isn't that really why the attacks were so virulent against Jeremy Corbyn? Because the programme, and it was a fairly modest socialist programme, it's got to be said. I don't think that they were quite as radical on the economy as I think they should and indeed could have been. But nevertheless, they were going to disturb the status quo. And it was for that reason, I think, was it not, that they were attacked, all manner of smears. And you've been subject to many smears, you should be well familiar with that, George. But, it seems that the establishment, the powers that be, are not prepared to see any disturbance of the status quo. And regrettably, there are many willing saps inside the Labour Party who are prepared to do their bidding, maybe their fifth columnists. And what I found particularly regrettable in 2018 was that the leadership didn't actually get behind the proposition to try and seize back, wrest control of the Labour Party and put it into the hands of its grassroots members. And I think had we democratised the party in that way, had we made the Parliamentary Labour Party accountable to its members, we might have had a better fighting chance, might we not, of Labour adopting a more socialist program. But in the reality now, I think we are in a situation where, like the United States, the two main parties are two sides of the same coin, aren't they?
Yes, two cheeks of the same backside, and never has that been more apparent now. As somebody joked on Twitter the other day, perhaps Keir Starmer will be the godfather to the new Boris Johnson child. So obvious has it been over the last few weeks when the Tories were there for the taking, when the country was falling apart, when our health service was falling apart. Along came the Labour Party to say now is not the time to be criticising and posing a distinct alternative. So it's more clear now than perhaps it's ever been, and it has been in the past, pretty obvious, that the Labour Party was Plan B, that the Tories were Plan A for the operation of capitalism, but if need be, if something has to be allowed to give a bit, then let's have a safe Labour Party that is not going to existentially challenge the ruling capitalist model, is not going to existentially challenge the imperialist foreign policy model. And of course, every Labour Prime Minister to date has fitted that bill, Tory Plan B. But Jeremy Corbyn, for a moment, I think it was exaggerated, if I'm being perfectly honest, and you and I helped exaggerate it because we wanted it so much that Jeremy Corbyn was an existential threat, or at least they thought he might lead to an existential threat, and so they were ready to destroy him. I'll tell you, because I'm an older man than you, I can tell you that I was right at the right hand for the decisive years of the late Mr. Benn. Now, Mr. Benn was greater than Michael Foot and greater than Jeremy Corbyn, as Jeremy would freely concede, in his ability to see, the clarity with which he could see another future that was possible, and his ability to articulate it. And by the way, this was in an era before the internet, long before the internet or YouTube or Facebook or Twitter. Imagine if Mr. Benn, at the height of his powers, had access to these tools instead of just a very narrow media that did its best to convince people that he was mad or bad or both. Mr. Benn's electrifying critique of capitalism was such that he would really have been a potential existential challenge. But that's never going to come again from the Labour Party. If the Labour Party could not be democratized under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell and Diane Abbott and so on, then it's not going to be under Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. So Labour Party members watching this, and many will be, have to face the fact that they are now locked into a future of fighting against their own party for the rest of their political lives and failing. Because if you couldn't succeed under Corbyn, you're not going to succeed under Starmer. They'll make sure the rules are written in such a way as to make it literally impossible for you to succeed. So the future has to be looked to elsewhere. But back to our subject, Chris, there are many possibilities, some of them very ugly, of what happens after this crisis. The United States now has a greater percentage unemployed than it did during the Great Depression of the 1930s. And only war, rearmament and war took the United States, and us for that matter, out of the Great Slump, the Great Depression, pictures of which we're all familiar with, but the reality of which no one alive today is still familiar with, or very few. And so the danger of capitalism taking a turn towards increasing authoritarianism and a militant path to war with China, with Russia, with Iran, as a means of kickstarting their own model is also very real. And that's why we cannot retreat into a Little England mentality when dealing with this. We have to be vitally concerned with what's happening elsewhere in the world too.
Yeah, I mean, when you mentioned Tony Benn there, I was reminded, and you talked about the Great Depression, and that really the world only recovered from that with the advent of war. And one of the things that Tony Benn used to regularly say was, if we can find the money to kill people, we can find the money to help people. And quite clearly, we can, and indeed should. And also your other point, George, about if Tony, imagine if Tony had access to the social media, these alternative media platforms that we have today, how much more effective he could have been. And frankly, I think the whole course of history could have been very, very different, not just in relation to Tony Benn. I think, the best leader the Labour Party never had, the best prime minister the country never had. But just imagine if the miners had access to social media, the print workers, the whole course of the industrial landscape, the great industrial struggles that took place in the 1980s and ultimately ended in defeat and jobs being offshored to low-wage economies and so on. I think Arthur Scargill and the NUM would have been in a far better position to have won that dispute. And as I say, the course of history would have been very, very different. But given where we are, George, in terms of the fact that we have two political parties now, obviously it's very different in Scotland now, but in England and Wales, two political parties who are two sides of the same coin, or as you put it, two cheeks of the same backside. What can we do? Look, I'm in the process of working with others to try and build a grassroots movement. We're seeking inspiration from movements like the Black Panther Party, in this country, the cooperative pioneers, where there was an abdication on the part of the state to provide for its citizens. Working class people came together and did it for themselves. So we're looking to try and build capacity in communities, to look at examples like the Mondragon Workers Cooperative. That is one of the biggest corporations now in Spain. It was started, as I'm sure you'll be well aware, George, by a Catholic priest at the height of Franco's rule in the Basque region. And the Catholic priest there said that if we wait for the government or we wait for some wealthy industrialist to come and create jobs for us, we'll all die of old age. So let's do it for ourselves. So that's one of the things we're looking to try and do, but also to promote street protests with building links with the Yellow Vest movement, the Gilets Jaunes in France, to create street art, alternative community radio platforms, but mainly to do all those things, yes, to raise consciousness and, yes, to raise capacity, but also to raise consciousness and raise expectations. Because I think people are been far too passive, in my opinion. We, the British people, have accepted far too much crap that's been poured upon us. As I've said, we're the fifth biggest economy in the world. And I just think I want to make people angry, in my opinion. I think, let's, if we can, encourage people, mobilize people to demand that this democracy, which doesn't really deserve the title democracy, because representative democracy has failed us. It's failed us consistently down the ages, in my opinion. And I ask the question, who are they representing? Representative democracy, who are they representing? If they were representing working people in this country, we wouldn't have 14 million people living in poverty. We wouldn't have thousands of people living on the streets, would we? We wouldn't have our public services in the terrible state that they are. So that's kind of one of the things that I'm doing. But what can we do, George? What would be your sort of prospectus, given that we've got two political parties who are not going to offer any radical alternative to the present status quo? And, when you look at that sometimes, you can get a bit depressed and think, well, it's just too big. There's nothing, we can't do anything about this. But I think we have to take inspiration from those movements and indeed from our antecedents, the pioneers of the labour movement and the struggles that they had to endure to inspire us to do more, to go further, and to bring people with us. Because let's remember, in every election, the biggest cohort are the non-voters. And that's the failure, in my opinion, of democracy, because it hasn't reached people, it hasn't inspired people, and many people, millions of people, don't feel it's worth voting. Democracy is not really for them. Politics ain't for them. Politicians are all the same. What is the often refrain that you get, isn't it? What do we do about that? How can we change that mindset and make people recognize that through collective solidarity, we're incredibly powerful? You know, the workers united will never be defeated. And if we could only get people to recognize that, we would be unstoppable, wouldn't we?
Well, the old world may be dying, but the new world certainly isn't yet ready to be born. That's the first thing that we must acknowledge, because if we deny it, we are denying reality. Boris Johnson is currently on 51%, imagine. Having presided over all of this, and he's still got an actual majority of supporters in the public opinion polls. The Labour Party has not only not had a Starmer bounce, it has been a complete dead parrot. And the likelihood in Scotland and Wales of Labour ever coming back, in Scotland, Labour has just recorded its lowest ever share of the vote in public opinion polls, 14%, mustn't exaggerate, 14% of the Scottish people intend to vote Labour next May for the Scottish Parliament. So Labour certainly isn't coming back in Scotland, and it is now, the Tories are now twice as popular as Labour in Wales. Do you ever think you'd hear such words? And little Sadiq Khan, the disastrous Labour mayor of London, is 6% ahead of the Conservatives in London, which is the only region in the entire country where Labour is in the lead, and only by 6%. So an alternative offer to the British people certainly needs to be made. Now, of course, your grassroots movement idea is not in any way antithetical to what we are doing. We are doing things that can be complementary to each other. But I'm the leader of the Workers' Party of Britain. We have a very clear socialist program, and we are recruiting hand over fist. We are actually literally running out of membership papers and cards to send out to people. So people are looking for an alternative, and we think that we can help provide that. We think that in the end, whilst all these things you mention are worthy and should be supported, and I support them, in the end, political power has to be organized. It has to be ready to take power. And in our country, that means ready to fight elections and to win them. It's not that elections are enough in and of themselves. There has to be a mass movement in support of the political program of the Socialist Party. And Mr. Benn had that, Mr. Corbyn had that, and in Mr. Corbyn's case, I'm sorry to say, they threw it all away. They were not only not prepared to carry through the tremendous swell of hundreds of thousands of people who were joining them, to carry that revolution through and reform, transform the Labour Party and its democracy and so on. Not only were they not prepared to do that, they even allowed the political assassination of their own people. And you are the best example of that, a living martyr to the failure of the Corbyn surge to take us there. So, as Mr. Ben, we've quoted him many times today, as Mr. Ben said, it's never over. There is no final victory. There is no final defeat. There is only struggle. And when we are too old to struggle, that 4 or 5 more come to pick up our rifle when we fall. So that's what we're doing. And building alternative media, as you mentioned, is a critical part of that, because without an increase in consciousness, we aren't going anywhere. We simply must win millions to our ideas. ITV, Robert Peston, is not going to give us the opportunity to do it. So we must use the revolutionary tools of the internet that now exist to build these platforms for ourselves. So I wish you all the best, Chris, in everything that you do. I did say at the time that I would never leave you alone to face the struggle that you have faced, and I never have left you alone.
No, and I appreciate that, George.
Not going to start now.
No, and I really appreciate that, George. And I've got to say, without sort of, blowing smoke at your backside in that sense, you are the personification of solidarity. And frankly, if there had been a little bit more solidarity from members of the Socialist campaign group of Labour MPs, then not just for me, but for many, many, many other people, and Jewish socialist members of the Labour Party who were shamefully accused of anti-Semitism, and at least one who I know whose parents survived Auschwitz, who was born in Israel, who served in the Israeli Defense Force. He's a very strong pro-Palestinian campaigner now, lives in this country now, obviously, was a party member. Similarly, his wife, born in Israel, also served in the IDF, and both of them very strong pro-Palestinian campaigners for human rights. I mean, who wouldn't be a pro-Palestinian? If you believe in human rights, you've got to be pro-Palestinian. I mean, what's been happening there with the Israeli apartheid regime? And they were expelled from the party, accused of anti-Semitism. It's just, I mean, you're kind of through the looking glass. I mean, it makes my blood boil every time I talk about this, because there's so many. I mean, and people like Jackie Walker, who I know you've interviewed on your programs, George, and I really do thank you for your support and solidarity, and you certainly led the way. And if only people, I don't know, you regularly posted about it and actually listened to you, then we may have actually got a little bit further. Because what was happening, and you're quite right, and I put it like this, that Jeremy's Praetorian Guard were being systematically executed, essentially, and so his strongest allies, his strongest supporters, his most effective supporters were being thrown under the bus. And in the end, or the ultimate goal was Jeremy and the Corbyn project. And it's game, set, and match, isn't it? They've totally succeeded. But what is ironic, before I go to some questions from viewers, I've got loads of questions coming in now, isn't it, that all of the malcontents in the Parliamentary Labour Party who were telling us that Corbyn couldn't win, that socialism, this kind of extreme socialism as they described it, was a vote loser, when we know all the opinion polls actually suggested that certainly the domestic programme is overwhelmingly popular. And here we are now with the new leader, and they are absolutely tanking in the polls, as you just very ably outlined, George. But George, let me just go to some questions, because they're piling up, and we did actually offer the opportunity for viewers to ask questions. And I'm sure a lot of people like to take the opportunity, as we've got both of us on the programme together now. And although we said we're going to go for an hour, George, I hope you're okay with that. We were due to finish at 2 o'clock, we were due to kick off at 1, but because of the technical difficulties, we ended up not starting till 10 past. So you're okay for another 10 minutes? So we'll finish at 10 past. That's great.
Yes.
Let me just go to then a question then, George, from Andrew McMenamin. And he said, how do we unite the many branches of the left so that we can become a formidable force in politics? What's your thoughts on that, George?
Well, there's 57 varieties, of course, of the left, and all have a different take on ideological questions, strategic, tactical questions. We should, as far as possible, avoid attacking each other It's a marketplace of ideas. We should try our best to sell our ideas to people, but as far as possible, avoid attacking others. There will be some people who will be in a position to fight elections, and some people who will not. It would be, of course, useful if you know, if we were not standing against each other in elections.
Yeah,
that would be useful. And as time goes on, as the struggle goes on, we'll be able to, I think, find issues on which we can agree and cooperate. Let's take a hypothetical. If there is war between the United States and Iran, we'll stand against that war. And all of us who do should march together. We should, of course, retain our political identity and our ideological identity, but we should be prepared to unite against such monstrosities as war. Still more if the war is against China instead of Iran, and no one should entirely rule that possibility out. Ditto when the railway workers or the postal workers are struggling to defend their wages and conditions and employment levels, then obviously all people who regard themselves as socialists must be with them. But we're not going to get, neither do I want a situation where you know, every Trotskyite organization comes together and all the Trotskyites come together with thee and me and so on. That's a pipe dream. We're trying to build a party without liberals and without Trotskyists, so we'll see how we do.
Well, good luck with that for sure. Certainly the Liberals have been a bane of my life, a bane of the Labour Party's life. That is a certain fact. And I think, you know, as Joe Cox said, there's certainly a lot more that unites us than divides us. And the Labour Party under its present leadership seems to be taking the party in a particular direction. And some people have been critical of me for suggesting that it's pointless staying in the Labour Party. They want to stay and fight. And good luck to them. But my point is, and I wrote an article for the Morning Star, which was posted online, I think, earlier this week. And I made the point that there is literally no avenue available to wrest control. Members, we just can't do it. The NEC's stitched up, the Parliamentary Labour Party is stitched up, and the bureaucracy is completely stitched up. It's that triumvirate that actually control the Labour Party. That's who owns the Labour Party. My argument during the Democracy Roadshow that I was running is that the party belongs to its members. And the people who work for the party, the people who are elected members, who are on the National Executive Committee, they're the party's servants. But in truth be told, I was wrong. They're the party, and they always behave as if they were the masters, and they are. They are. And, you know, people will, I believe, expend a lot of energy for zero return, and I think they'll become incredibly frustrated. And I think there are other things that people can do to actually make more of a difference outside the Labour Party. But obviously people will make their own choice in relation to that. But on your general point about you know, what we can do, certainly I think where we can find common ground, if we can build something, you know, like a rainbow coalition, for want of a better way of putting it, then I think that's what we need to be looking to do. There's a question here, George, from somebody, Judith Wright. She's saying, is identity politics a problem for the left? What's your thoughts on that?
I think it's a major problem, and that's what I had in mind when I mentioned liberals on the subject of sides, of backsides and coins. In my experience, and the reason why I made the point I did about Trotskyites, a Trotskyite is one side of a coin on which the liberals are the other. Liberals with a small L I'm talking about. And one of the things that unites them is this absolute infatuation with identity politics. I think identity politics has been the curse of the Labour movement for a long time, by the way, going back almost as long as I've been in it, which is a very long time indeed. The perception that parts of the working class can be liberated individually, even though a fixation on that individual liberation is alienating and dividing the working class, which otherwise should have one overarching, overriding identity. Let me take the most extreme example. I don't know how many transsexual people there are in the country, and I swear to you, as God is my judge, and from a pure heart, I wish no harm on any transsexual, and I would literally die, give my life's blood to stand beside them if they were under attack. And I ask you before God to believe me on that. But if I make a fetish, for want of a better word, if I make a preoccupation the issue of transsexuals being women, for example, which is a scientific nonsense, scientific absurdity, then I first of all alienate actual women, and then I alienate huge sections of the working class who can see that for the bonkers nonsense that it is. Then I allow the ruling classes, mass media, to get to work on me, and before you know it, all the other things I stand for can't get a hearing because I have made myself a caricature of liberalism by insisting, as Rebecca Long Bailey did, as Lisa Nandy did, as everyone except Keir Starmer did, this absurd incantation that transsexual women are women. They're not. They're something different. And they have rights, and they must be defended, but they are not women. Now, I give you that extreme example, but there, of course, are other examples. You don't need to be Einstein to work them out. But it became a litmus test of whether or not you were left to agree to that. And, militant feminists who've, over the ages, been known as militant feminists were being kicked out of the Labour Party, being no platformed in universities and colleges. Germaine Greer, deplatformed. Linda Bellos, kicked out, driven out of the Labour movement. Well, that was when, if you'll forgive the phrase, identity politics disappeared up its own fundament. But I'm afraid the people who call themselves left have not all seen that yet.
No, indeed. I think one of the best responses I've heard to a question about identity politics was given by Bernie Sanders. I don't know if you saw it. He was at a town hall meeting and somebody asked him a question about identity politics. And he said, let me answer it in this way. You probably won't like the response I'm about to give. And this is an issue where we're going to have to fight this out in the Democratic Party, he said, because many people disagree with me. But he said, look, it's a given that we want more women, we want more Black people, we want more Latinos in politics. He said, that's a given. I'm on board with that. He said, but it isn't good enough if your prospectus when you come for selection is to say, vote for me, support me as a candidate because I'm a woman, or because I'm Black, or because I'm Latino. That's not the question. The question has to be, what are you going to do for the working class? And I've got to say, at that town hall meeting, it's on YouTube. People can Google it and see it. It got a very, very positive reaction, but it is an issue which has afflicted the left, and it's corrupted the left, I think, and it's in my opinion, it's been a distraction. And New Labour was good at this, of course. They ignored class politics in that sense, and all their efforts were put into identity politics. Now you have the absurdity of Boris Johnson claiming he's got the most diverse cabinet in history. Because he's got, women and people of colour. I mean, these people represent the ruling class. They're not diverse in any way, shape, or form. It's an absolute nonsense. Anyway, listen, moving on, George, and we've got 15 minutes, so I'll try and whip through some of these if I can. there's a question here from somebody who is asking, it's a foreign policy issue actually, what about Kashmir from Unity News? What's your thoughts on that? And I was very disappointed, I've got to say. I know why I should be disappointed still, but having spent 44 years in the Labour Party, when when they do things which are crazy, which are unacceptable, I do still find myself feeling disappointed. But the way in which Keir Starmer's backed down in relation to the party position on Kashmir, I think is absolutely despicable. It's cowardly. And it's certainly a million miles from embracing an ethical foreign policy, in my opinion. But what's your thoughts, George, on that?
Yeah, it's not only an utterly immoral turn by Starmer on the Kashmir question, it's also electorally suicidal.
Yeah.
The reality is that Labour had a huge vote of 1 million or more from people of Kashmiri origin in this country who would never have considered voting anything else but Labour. And Keir Starmer just threw all of that away. His betrayal of the Kashmir cause and Labour Party policy, for that matter, is absolute. He says that the fate of the people currently under maximum quarantine. You think we're living under quarantine? Try living in occupied Kashmir, where for decades they have been living under oppression of an extreme kind, but where over the last 6 months or so, nine months now, they have been living under absolute quarantine, with people not even able to phone their own parents back home, with people dying for the want of medical treatment and so on. Kashmir is like Gaza, except in bigger form. And to say that the fate of the people of Kashmir is a matter for the right-wing controlled Indian parliament, not a matter for the international community, not a matter for us as the former colonial power, but a matter for Mr. Modi. It's like saying that the plight of the people in Gaza is a matter for Mr. Netanyahu. Maybe that'll be the next thing that Starmer says.
Well, indeed. Well, I mean, there's UN resolutions, isn't there, going back to, is it 1947 or 48, in relation to Kashmir, which has never been implemented. I mean, it is a scandal. George, just going on to a couple of other ones, there's been a theme, actually, quite a few questions coming through on this. And this is just one, and I'll read this question, then we'll go on to another one. It's just more of a statement, really, than you might want to respond to it. This one's from Helen, but there's many, many others in a similar vein saying, will George and Chris join forces to lead a revolution? So think about that one for a minute. And then one which perhaps you want to spend a little bit more time on is from Karen Corridon. And she's saying, as it stands, any attempt to overturn or replace neoliberalism with socialist economics will be smeared by the billionaire-owned media. And she's asking, how do we fight this? What do you think?
Well, on the latter point, of course, we have already been talking about it, and we are right at this moment doing it.
Yes.
This discussion between Chris Williamson and I could not happen in the billionaire-owned media. The good news is that the newspapers are losing money hand over fist, and I was brought up on the dictum that not until the last editor is strangled with the last copy of the billionaire-owned press will we be truly free. And with the due account of the changes in technology, that is, of course, true. So we will never be assisted by, how could we be, by media that is owned by people whose interests we threaten. We would be asking them for Christian charity way beyond their means to give, to allow them to help us. But the good news is, whereas I, and to some extent Chris, because he's younger, because we grew up as activists where you used to have to type a stencil and put it on a drum full of ink and turn a handle and produce an A4 piece of paper, smudges and all, and then cut that A4 piece piece of paper into smaller parts, and then go out onto only your own street that you could reach with your own legs, and hand it out to bemused passers-by. All of that is gone. And I have well over 1 million followers on social media that I can and do communicate with all day long. And this method is even newer. The one that Chris is using now, this Zoom, and we do it too. We have a public meeting every Tuesday night, a members meeting every Wednesday night by Zoom. So that's the answer to that question. We are forging new paths, and we need to get better at it. And younger people who are more familiar with the keyboard need to help older lads like Chris and me to make the transmission of our ideas ever more attractive and smooth and uninterrupted. And we are perfectly capable of doing that. Chris and I talk all the time. We are brothers. I have stood beside him in his worst moments, and I will always do so. I hope that we can work together. I hope that we can fight campaigns and elections even together. But that's obviously for the future and not to be decided in public on a screen. But both Chris and I are equally committed to a socialist transformation of Britain and indeed the world, and we'll do whatever we can to work together to achieve it.
And just talking about us being a couple of old lags, George, we have to also remember that 60 is the new 30. So, you know, we've got plenty of life in us yet. So if people are thinking that we are going to be hanging up our boots anytime soon, they've got another thing coming.
In fact, my wife thinks I'm 45.
Yes, well, there you go, mate. Yeah, well, 60 is the new 30, mate. You're only, what, about 33 now, are you? 32 and a half or something like that? So, yeah, so there's plenty of time for us to go. Sonia Latchford's asked an interesting question, George. She's saying, if either of you were able, would you return to the Labour Party?
I can't speak for you. I certainly would not. I've got to tell you, and Chris already now knows this, he was slower to know it than me, that the Labour Party is the most, and Labour MPs and Parliament are the most unfraternal, the most vicious, the most self-seeking, the most individualistic place I have ever worked. I started work in the Michelin tire factory in Dundee in Scotland. It was a far more collegiate and fraternal place to work than the Labour Party. There was, amongst my workmates, a feeling of us, feeling of us and always. I'm afraid that is not present in the Labour Party or in Parliament, and I could think almost of nothing worse than to return to the Labour Party. From my point of view, and I know Chris has said this too, the Labour Party really is truly finished, and you're living in denial, and you're only setting out on a path of great pain for no purpose if you are one of those who says you're staying in the Labour Party in order to fight. Fight for what? You're going to fight your own party. You're going to fight your own leader, and he's going to make sure that you do that fighting with one arm tied behind your back and your legs chained together to make sure you can't fight effectively.
I mean, look, the party in the country, there are many very decent people, although I know thousands, probably tens of thousands have now left the party. But George is absolutely right about the parliamentary Labour Party is an incredibly toxic, nasty, bullying environment. And all of the things that were levelled against the supporters of Jeremy Corbyn about smears and about bullying and all stuff which is put out, the alleged attacks that were being perpetrated against right-wing, predominantly female MPs. The argument was that we were so obnoxious, the people on the left, that they were bullying female MPs, which was a complete falsehood. most, if not all, of those attacks were from the extreme right on on social media and so on. But in the parliamentary Labour Party meetings themselves, I don't know if it was like when you were there, George, but I've never encountered such a toxic environment. In my very last meeting, I was asked to go along by people in Jeremy's office because Jeremy was speaking about Brexit. And I said, are you sure you want me to go? Because they hate me. Whenever I turn up, they heckle me. And they said, no, we'd like you to go and speak. So I said, fair enough. And I tried to make a contribution. I wasn't just heckled, I was absolutely howled down. And the sort of things I was saying was that, look, we all joined the Labour Party, didn't we? Because we believed in social justice. We all joined the Labour Party, didn't we? Because we believed in some sort of an ethical foreign policy. Actually, I'm not sure they did in reality. But anyway, I was making that point. And I said, can't we find it within ourselves, therefore? Maybe we're taking, different tracks, different roads to reach the destination, but ultimately our destination is similar, isn't it? It's the same. I was absolutely howled down for saying such a thing. And I even evoked Joe Cox and said, there's more that unites us than divides us. And again, I'm not sure that was true in reality. But the very fact that I'd quoted Joe was seen as a complete anathema to them. And it was an appalling, dreadful environment. And, that opportunity, I think, to take a grip, get a grip, take control of the party, to democratize the party, to make MPs accountable, was squandered. And I don't think that opportunity is ever going to come back again. And so I think we need to, in my opinion anyway, focus on a different way forward. A question here from Lizzie, George. We've got about less than 5 minutes. This might have to be the last one. And very many apologies to the many other questioners. I'm sorry, we just haven't had the time. But she's asking, American trade talks start tomorrow. How can we stop the sale of the National Health Service? Any thoughts on that in the last few minutes?
I think myself that it would be very difficult for Boris Johnson in this current climate to put the National Health Service on the table in the negotiations with Donald Trump. You can't rule out, of course, their chutzpah, their insouciance is high. But I very much doubt if the National Health Service will be openly and above the table placed upon it. But you see, the process, there's more than one way to skin a cat. This cat has been being skinned for 40 years, not 10. And the salami slicing of the National Health Service will, if they can get away with it, continue. And the United States government, if it stays true to its course, will publicly disavow any wish to take over the National Health Service. But they've got their man in there anyway. The Mr. Stevens and his background in the private healthcare industry, it's Crippen being put in charge of the blood bank. That's already been achieved. So the process of privatization, sell-off, will continue by stealth if they can. But I don't expect anything dramatic in the trade talks, selling off the NHS. As we know, every Thursday night now at 8 o'clock, the National Health Service is by far the most popular thing about Britain. And any politician would have to proceed with betraying it with great danger, and I don't think that will happen.
I'm sure if they could, they would, but it may be just politically too difficult for them. And I think we need to take heart from the wonderful outpouring of solidarity with the NHS and health workers that we're seeing every Thursday. And remember those words, and I quoted them the other night when we had Dr. Bob Gill and Dr. Sarah Gangoli on Resistance TV, and the words of Guy Bevan, who said that the NHS will last for as long as there are folks willing to fight for it. George, we're sort of out of time, but I just want to ask this very final one because it's from Cyril Chilson. Cyril is one of the Jewish members of or former members of the Labour Party, who was expelled from the Labour Party, whose parents survived Auschwitz. It's one of the most grotesque, disgusting, and despicable actions that the party took against Cyril, and I just feel I should just make the point that Cyril has put in his question here. Well, the first thing is a statement, and then a very quick response from you, George, if we can, on his question. But he's saying, given the disgraceful witch hunt and the ensuing submission of the Labour Party to the henchmen of a foreign country through the infamous 10 pledges that you'll remember that all three candidates signed up to from the Board of Deputies, how can the left see a future in the Labour Party? But his other point is, what's your opinion of Blue Labour? And that will probably have to be the last question, George. Any thoughts on Blue Labour? If you're familiar with Blue Labour, Maurice Glassman's out.
To be perfectly frank, I'd be closer to Blue Labour than I am to Starmer Labour or Blair Labour, but Blue Labour doesn't go anywhere near far enough. But in terms of their identification with the country and its people and its traditions, I identify with that. I'm quite a socially conservative person, and I think that the majority of the British public, even those that voted Labour, were always a bit concerned about the extent to which Labour seemed kind of alien to them, going against the grain for them. I've always loved Spitfires and Hurricanes and always advocated that Battle of Britain Day, which is right in the middle of hopefully a glorious summer, should be a big thing. And should have been made a big thing by Labour. After all, Labour's leaders historically had, by and large, wonderful records in the war, including Major Healy, to whom you referred earlier, but Mr. Benn and others were all people who put their lives on the line in the Second World War. But to answer Cyril's overarching point, you've got to face this. Every Labour Party member watching this has to face this. Your party is now, not just as we spoke earlier, on the side of Modi in Kashmir, it is on the side of Netanyahu in Israel-Palestine. If you're prepared to be in such a party and see that arch continue into the unforeseeable distance, well, good luck to you, but I don't think you'll be happy in that. Any expression of support for the Kashmiri people or the Palestinian people will increasingly place you at risk of expulsion, even if you are Jewish, even if your parents, like Cyril's, were survivors or not of the Holocaust, the mass murder of 6 million Jews in Europe in the 1930s and 40s. Even if you are from that stock, you will not survive. Your Labour membership will not survive. You've seen the money, you've seen the figures, you've seen the surrender, and there's no reason to disbelieve Mr. Starmer when he says that he is a Zionist and proud of it, and that anyone who challenges Zionist ideology will be hunted out. They're trying to hunt out even Diane Abbott at this
We've had a few questions on that, George, as well, actually.
Yeah, and who knows? They may succeed, Chris. They may very, very well succeed. The idea, I must say, of Nick Brown giving a stern talking to someone of the seniority of Diane Abbott for appearing on a Zoom meeting. I have no idea, by the way, who else is on this Zoom meeting. Let me say, for the record, I have no idea who else is on it. It's absurd and offensive. So if you support the Palestinians, if you support the Kashmiris, not much future for you in Keir Starmer's Labour Party. Sorry.
Listen, George, we're out of time now. We've gone over 5 minutes over time. Thanks for sticking with us, and apologies to everybody tuning in who for the delay at the start of the extended broadcast. I hope you found it interesting. I certainly did. I'm very, very grateful to you again, George. Thank you for your time. We'll continue to talk. Good luck in your endeavours. And hopefully between us, we can actually overcome the massive forces which are ranged against us. But I'll just leave people with the message that look, unity is strength, and if we recognise that our collective solidarity and can come together in unity, then we will overcome. We will overcome all of those odds. We just have to recognise the power which is in our own hands. It's up to us. I know George and I certainly will, and many, many others will do everything we can to try and defeat the forces which are ranged against us, and to try and build a kind of decent, compassionate, caring country that I think the vast majority of the British public want to see. So thanks again for tuning in, and good afternoon.
Thank you.